The last Sunday of Lent, today, is like the first Sunday in Lent in two ways. One is that both Sundays have a gospel story that is always told on that week, year after year. Different gospels, different versions, same story. And the second, I think, is that those two stories are bookends to each other, tied together by a common theme. The story always told on the first Sunday of Lent is the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness at the very, very start of his ministry. He goes straight from his baptism into the harsh Judean wilderness, led there by the Spirit of God to be tested by Satan. Thanks, God. And the story always told today, Palm Sunday, is the story of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which marks the start of the last week of Jesus' ministry, indeed the last week of his life. When Luke's gospel tells the story of the temptations at the beginning, his account ends with a detail that's unique to his gospel. Luke chapter 4, verse 13 tells us, "When the devil had finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time." Doom, doom, doom. I've always thought that the events set in literal motion on Palm Sunday, as Jesus takes a ride on a donkey's colt that has never been ridden before, never done that, and descends from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem, that represents that opportune time from Luke 4:13. To make a comparison from academia, the temptations of Jesus, which preceded even the calling of any of his disciples, was his entrance exam into ministry. The event in Jerusalem that we mark today is the start of the most brutal final exam in history. And both events were testing the same exact thing. Would Jesus be faithful to what God called him to be and to do? Jesus' fidelity to God and to the mission ahead was tested by Satan at the beginning from three different angles. Jesus has been fasting for 40 days in a desert wilderness, and Satan tempts him to turn the stones into bread. That's the temptation to use the power God has given Jesus for himself, to satisfy his own bodily needs in a way ordinary humans would not have been able to do. Jesus refuses. God becoming flesh means he's got to do the things the way humans do them. No extra advantages. Number two, the power to skip over the hard part ahead, but still do good for all the kingdoms of the earth, merely by giving Jesus' allegiance over to Satan instead of God. Presumably, Jesus could still do all the wonderful things he wanted to do for the world if he just took that deal. He only had to acknowledge Satan instead of God as his master, and it would all be instantly given to him. Jesus again refuses. Lastly, Satan tempts him with attracting worshipers with grand and braggadocious shows of God's favor. Leap off the top of the temple, Jesus, your own viral moment when everyone in the capital city can watch in amazement as angels swoop down and catch you. The religious leaders could never doubt you after that. Think how many disciples would flock to you. You know you're too important for God to let you fall. Show the world who you really are, and all the rest of this will be easy. Jesus rebukes Satan that third time, and with that passes the entrance exam. He took that test while physically exhausted and drained, in harsh conditions around him, and with no specific knowledge of how the next years of his life were going to play out. But he was sure of one thing, the thing that had been drummed into him since he was a boy from the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting in verse 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words that I'm commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you're at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. There is no other commandment that has those kinds of requirements for display and constant repetition, multiple times every single day. Jesus had heard the stories of his people, studied them, and watched firsthand the faithfulness of his mother and father, and how that central command to love God was made manifest in their lives. The great risks that both Mary and Joseph took to make sure he was born and cared for, despite their limited means. The time they fled the country and lived in Egypt for years to escape King Herod's brutality and to save his life. Jesus learned his faithfulness to God first from his parents. As Jesus sits on the back of a young colt and enters Jerusalem for the last time, it became his turn to model faithfulness to that command in full view of the city, not by leaping off the temple roof, but by being lifted up on a cross and nailed in place. And that last week was indeed an opportune time for the even more extreme versions of Jesus' initial temptations. After 3 grueling and frustrating years of 24/7 ministry, when he would watch even his closest disciples fall asleep on the night he most needed them to stay awake, and then within 24 hours deny even knowing him, when he would be beaten and mocked and tortured and nailed to a cross, would he be faithful still? Would he give in and use his power to spare himself the physical pain? Would he make some deal with Herod or Pilate, maybe pledge his allegiance to Caesar publicly to allay fears of a revolution and maybe save his life? Would he call on angels to miraculously remove him from the cross, as his tormentors called on him to do? He saved others, they mocked. Let him save himself if he's the Messiah of God, his chosen one. Jesus proved faithful. He refused those temptations from the wilderness, even in extremis, even at this final, most opportune time. We've been walking through the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, 22 and 23 across these weeks of Lent, and faithfulness is one of 3 remaining. In this final week of Jesus' life, he shows us both what pure and complete faithfulness looks like, and what it costs. But its presence on Paul's list of the fruit of the Spirit implies that faithfulness is a virtue that can be evident in the life of every person who has God's Spirit within them. You don't have to be divine in the way that Jesus was to be faithful. So it's worth taking a little time to explore what faithfulness looks like in more everyday circumstances, how we can cultivate its fruit within us, and why our faithfulness is just as important to God's saving of the world as the faithfulness of Jesus was. The Greek word is pistis, which can just mean faith, as in a belief. But in the construction in Galatians 5, the better translation is the one we have in English, faithfulness, or sometimes fidelity. It's the character of one who can be relied on, someone who keeps their promises. So the fruit of faithfulness we're talking about here is not a belief in God, but becoming a reliable person, someone whose word is their bond, someone whose values are anchored and trustworthy from one day and 1 week and 1 month and 1 year to the next. In the Christian context, our example is Jesus. Jesus' faithfulness to God is meant to show for the world the unshakable faithfulness of God to us, proclaiming that God is our faithful companion in and through all things, and whose promises can be trusted, just as those around Jesus could trust in him. And that proclamation of the nature of God is the goal of our faithfulness as well. If you rewind the tape to Genesis chapter 1, it says human beings are made in the image of God. That means that part of our calling on this earth is to be faithful in our efforts to grow and polish and show forth that image, which includes all the attributes on the fruit of the Spirit list that we've been ticking through every week: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. When we fail in our attempts to produce those fruits in our lives, we are bearing false witness about the nature of God by projecting a false image of what God is like. And those who partake of that warped fruit we offer are poisoned by it, rather than made healthy and whole as God intended. The fact that we can be forgiven and are given constant opportunities to try again and do better is a miracle of grace, and all of us need that. But it doesn't undo whatever damage our failures have caused. That's why public confession and accountability is so important. It's like a fruit recall notice. Oh, no, I messed up. Don't eat that. That batch was bad. That's not what God is really like. And if some have eaten of our poison before that recall, we had darn well better help with the medical bills. Faithfulness has been under siege for decades now, in large part because faithfulness is undermined when it's not reciprocal. People were faithful to their employers when their employers returned the favor. Back when a company was willing to cut you some slack in hard times, employees would grind it out when it was tough on the business side. People were faithful to their country when the country was faithful to its citizens. In short, faithfulness implies a partner, a spouse, a friend, a company, a country, ultimately a God. Earlier this year, we talked in depth about the biblical concept of covenant. Covenants don't work as intended if the parties who take the vows then fail to uphold them. And all it takes to undermine the whole thing is to see some parties break the covenant with no regret and no consequences. That's why you have organizations like the American Bar Association, who can strip licenses from lawyers who maybe haven't broken the law, but have not been faithful to the oath of their profession. Same for doctors, same for clergy, same for elected officials, for accountants, many others. Like we've seen with all of the fruit of the Spirit, we set ourselves up for failure if we see any of them as only individual virtues. Yes, each of us has our own work to do, but the chances of being able to exhibit the fullness of any of the fruit of the Spirit, or to keep any of God's commandments, without being part of a group in covenant relationship to help each other stay on track and to hold each other accountable, are slim. United we stand, divided we fall. Rugged individualism is a myth. Ragged individualism is what you get when you try that. We help each other through, or we do not get through. And that's true whether the cause is righteous or horrible. People take vows and practice unwavering faithfulness to some truly awful causes. Gangs and cults and terrorist organizations succeed or fail according to that same human trait that's true for all of us. We are stronger in bonded groups than we are on our own. As we talked about in the first week of this series, love is first on Paul's list because putting all of the fruit in service to love is what makes them fruit of the Spirit, rather than fruit of the devil or fruit of some other thing. As simple personality characteristics, every one of them, including faithfulness, can be corrupted and twisted to harmful ends if love is not the motivating and guiding principle for their practice. The first thing Jesus did after passing his entrance exam in the wilderness was to call a group of disciples to travel with him and learn from him. As a reminder, the practice of discipleship in Jesus' day was a well-established tradition, with rules for the community of disciples that were set by the individual rabbi that they chose to follow. They were all in it together once they signed up. Jesus' disciples learned his lessons at varying rates. Some were taken apart from the others for more intense instruction. All of them lost faith in him at one time or another. Only one of the 12 closest to him had the courage to stand by him at the cross. And one actually betrayed him to his death. But what the last week of Jesus' life shows us is that there was no amount of unfaithfulness on their part that could shake the faithfulness of Jesus to God, to the work God called him to do, and to being a faithful companion to all those he called, even to the end. And that faithfulness to them meant his witness to God's faithfulness to humanity as a whole was intact, right through the end of his life. Back in Genesis, Adam failed the test of faithfulness. All God asked of him was not to eat just one of many of the fruit, all the many fruits in the garden, just one. And that story has stood throughout time as the failure that wrecked the world. But the story doesn't just represent one person messing up on one seemingly inconsequential demand where the punishment seems to far outweigh the crime. The failure in Genesis was a failure to be faithful to God. And as Jesus says in Luke 16, verse 10, whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If Adam couldn't keep himself from eating just one single piece of fruit when he was literally in paradise, the notion that he could bear witness to the full image of God in the much harder circumstances of the life that would come was untenable. Adam needed constraints and accountability pronto. Paul calls Jesus the new Adam, the one who gets faithfulness right in much, much harder circumstances. And because the image of God could shine so clearly and brightly through Jesus, Because he managed to be faithful despite it all, here we are, 2,000 years later. Adam's failure broke the world. Jesus' faithfulness saved it, with all who were able to see it saved by his witness to the true nature of God's irresistible love and faithfulness to us. And yet, the religion that bears his name has failed so frequently and so badly as to become almost blasphemy for some, for many. The disgust so many feel for Christianity today has come about in part because the witness of Jesus was so strong and so clear that the hypocrisy of those who speak in his name without practicing the values that he taught or showing forth the fruit that are signs of his Spirit is evident to everybody. All religions see Jesus as a guiding light. There are atheist for Jesus groups. And many, many people leave the church specifically stating that their departure is because they don't find the values of Jesus practiced in this institution. For some, church is simply irrelevant, ignoring the challenges of the world they live in. For many, they have experienced actual harm. The stark divide between how people view Jesus and how people view the church established in Jesus' name is exactly what is at stake in our ability to become not just faithful individuals, but a faithful people. If the influence of one life, faithfully lived, could have such an impact, imagine if there were more. We need to start again to learn to be faithful. We deceive ourselves if we expect people, including ourselves, to rise to a big challenge who have never risen to a small one. It's in learning to practice the fruit of the Spirit in small things that we become capable of stepping up to the big things and the big moments. We can, to take the metaphor, go back and practice just not eating this one fruit. We can find one small way to practice being faithful until that small thing is unshakable. Faithfully walk the dog. Faithfully keep in touch with a friend. Faithfully care for yourself. Faithfully contribute time, talent, or treasure to an important cause doing the work of God in the world. Pick a small thing and see how it goes. If you pick a small thing and you fail at it a lot, you are not a bad person, you just started too big. Pick something smaller. Make a promise and stick to it, asking for God to increase your love until that love propels you to be faithful to that tiny task. When you can be totally relied on through thick and thin on one small thing, step it up a notch. Go bigger. The fruit of faithfulness is growing within you. All of that will be easier if we join with someone else who is also seeking to be faithful. And go for it together. Don't let the myth of rugged individualism sabotage your efforts and make you ragged instead. Even Jesus leaned on a group and continued to love and lean on them even after they let him down. Practice being a faithful companion on life's road as a witness to the one who is faithful to us even through the valley of the shadow. One of the ways we see faithfulness every week is in the faithfulness of our choir. To attend rehearsals every week, to come early on Sundays, to rehearse some more, and then to bless us with their music, filled to the brim with God's Spirit. One of our prayer requests this morning is for a member of a different choir far away, Ajua's brother, Franklin, in Ghana, who had a massive stroke this past week while he was at his own choir practice. May we remember his faithfulness and pray for his recovery as our own choir comes now to bless us with the anthem. Amen.